Welcome to our discussion of Meditation 6, concerning the existence of material things and the real distinction between mind and body. Here are the key elements in Meditation 6 that we're going to discuss briefly. First, there's the distinction between reason and imagination, which leads Descartes to a modification of his view concerning the essence of the mind. Then, I want briefly to discuss Descartes' argument for the existence of corporeal objects, and finally, have a quick look at how he overcomes the dreaming argument, and finally, resolves all the doubts that had arisen in Meditation 1. Let's begin with the distinction between reason and the imagination. Now, what the thinker notices in Meditation 6 is that imagining requires a mental effort that is not required in understanding. When I have to imagine a dragon, for example, it's as if I have to make a certain kind of mental effort. I have to spend some mental energy to focus the capacity I have to conjure up images to create this image in my mind. But understanding does not seem to require that same kind of effort to produce pictures. And furthermore, says Descartes, it's clear that I can understand things that I cannot imagine. For example, I can understand a myriagon or a chiliagon. A myriagon is just a plain geometrical figure with 1,000 sides. And as soon as I say what those words mean, you understand what I mean, even if you cannot picture in your mind a geometrical figure with 1,000 equal sides. Likewise, a chiliagon is just a plain geometrical figure with 1,000,000 equal sides. And as soon as I say what that word means, you understand the concept of a chiliagon, or Descartes would say the idea of a chiliagon, without necessarily being able to picture in your mind a chiliagon. And your understanding isn't merely that you understand what the word means, because, for example, you could prove mathematically what the interior angles of a chiliagon add up to, and discover many of its other properties. So there are many things we can understand that we cannot imagine. And again here, it's fruitful to remember that for Descartes, imagining is taken pretty literally as the capacity of the mind to produce pictures or images in the mind. So now, says Descartes, since what is really unique to me as a thinking thing is my capacity to reason, it seems clear that the imagination is not part of my essence. It is not part of what it is to be a thinking thing. In other words, even if I did not have the capacity to imagine, I would still be a thing that thinks. So if we look back to Meditation 2 on page 66, that small paragraph near the top of the page where Descartes says, "But what then am I? A thing that thinks." What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, and that also imagines and senses. Now he's saying, no, I would still be a thinking thing even if I didn't have the capacity to imagine. And he also points out, I would still be a thinking thing even if I did not have any sensory perceptions. Because what I am, after all, is just a pure intellect. Let's then look at this argument that Descartes gives for the existence of corporeal objects. Now, the first thing to say about this argument is that it's very similar to the argument for the existence of God in Meditation 3. Now, if you'll remember the sketch of the argument for the existence of God, it looks like this. Causal principle, source of ideas principle, I have an idea of God, and therefore God exists. Now, that sketch, of course, doesn't explain the reasoning that leads us from the premises to the conclusion, and we know that that reasoning is rather subtle. But in overall structure, the argument for the existence of corporeal objects is actually very similar. It uses both the causal principle and the source of ideas principle. And then the last premise is different. Instead of saying I have an idea of God, it says I have ideas of corporeal objects. And the conclusion is, therefore, corporeal objects exist. But now the reasoning that gets us from the premises to the conclusion is importantly different in the case of corporeal objects as it was in the case for the existence of God. And here's why. If you'll remember the structure that is established by the difference between objective reality and formal reality. You'll remember that we came to the conclusion that God exists because the idea of God has so much objective reality that I cannot possibly be the cause of that idea because I am imperfect and I don't have enough formal reality. In the case of corporeal objects, things are a little bit different. Ideas of corporeal objects are ideas of finite substances, and I am a finite substance, so it could be that I am the cause of my ideas of corporeal objects. That does not violate the causal principle. However, Descartes points out that if I were the cause of my ideas of corporeal objects, something would be truly amiss, because then it would be the case that God created my mind so that I am perpetually deceived. Somehow my mind, without my knowing it, is creating the illusion of me experiencing a world filled with physical objects. And if that's what's going on, and that's how God created my mind, then God is a deceiver. But God cannot be a deceiver, so therefore I cannot be the cause of my ideas of corporeal objects. Similarly, now that we know that God exists, it's entirely consistent with the causal principle for God to be the cause of my ideas of corporeal objects. So maybe God created a universe where the only two things that exist are the mind of God and my mind. But I have the illusion of living in a world filled with physical objects because God is sort of transmitting these ideas of corporeal objects into my mind. But if that's how things are, then again, God is a deceiver of the worst possible sort, because I could never figure out that I am being deceived in just that way. So no matter how you look at it, unless it is really corporeal objects that are the cause of my ideas of corporeal objects, God is a deceiver. Or to say it slightly differently, the only way that God is going to turn out not to be a deceiver, which of course for Descartes he is not, is if corporeal objects actually cause my ideas of corporeal objects. And that, rather roughly, is how Descartes arrives at the conclusion that corporeal objects actually exist. So let's now move on and try to take stock of where we are. We are right near the end of sixth meditation, which is the end of meditations in general. The thinker knows he exists. The thinker knows God exists. And now the thinker knows that corporeal objects exist. An important addition, after Descartes proves that corporeal objects exist, is that he says that what I know about them that is true is just their mathematical properties. And this will be an important theme that will arise later when we look at Descartes' rationalism. But for now, we notice that there's still one nagging doubt from first meditation. Because although we have overcome the origins of my mind argument, we have not yet overcome the dreaming argument. How do I know that I'm not dreaming, that I'm seeing physical objects when in fact I'm not? What Descartes says is that now he can trust his memory. And by appealing to his memory, he can notice that there really is a very big difference between dreaming sensations and waking sensations. And the difference is that waking sensations are spatiotemporally continuous. In our dreams, it can happen that I'm having one experience at one moment. Maybe I'm dreaming that I'm camping in the Grand Canyon, and then I come out of the tent and suddenly I'm in the middle of a classroom. The continuity of our sensations in our dreams is not at all guaranteed in the way that it seems to be in our waking lives. In our waking lives, I never open a door of a classroom and suddenly find myself at the foot of the Eiffel Tower. But in a dream, that can happen. Now, what's really important here, which is pretty much in between the lines and an issue that Descartes doesn't really discuss explicitly, is that we can only tell that difference between sequences of events if we appeal to our memory. But at the very beginning of second meditation, or meditation 2, Descartes says that he's going to call his memory into doubt. And it's only in meditation 6, after he proves that physical objects exist, that he thinks he can rely on the kinds of memories that he believed were stored in the brain. And it's those memories of events that he believed were stored in the brain that allow us to distinguish waking sensations from dream sensations. So, despite the phenomenological sameness of dream sensations and waking sensations, despite the fact that they feel the same, it seems to me the same whether I'm dreaming that I'm seeing the Grand Canyon as opposed to actually seeing it. Even though they seem the same and they are phenomenologically the same, I now can tell the difference between dream sensations and waking sensations by considering a series of sensations. And that's how Descartes finally overcomes the dreaming argument.